He abandoned his son for decades, but when they finally reunite, a shocking truth changes everything. Will forgiveness be possible, or is it too late? The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the window of the tiny apartment where Jack sat, staring at the creased photo of his son, Ben. He traced the edges of the picture with trembling fingers, the boy's wide, innocent eyes piercing through the storm in his heart. The room felt suffocating, every piece of worn furniture a reminder of his failures. He hadn't been able to keep a steady job in months, let alone provide for Ben. There wasn't enough food in the cupboards, not enough heat to fend off the bitter winter air seeping through the cracks. His hands shook as he folded the photograph and slid it into the envelope alongside a letter he'd rewritten a dozen times. Each word felt like a knife twisting in his chest. This is for his own good. He deserves better than this. Better than me. The mantra repeated in his mind like a broken record, drowning out the voice screaming that he was making a terrible mistake. Jack rose slowly, his knees aching as he crossed the room. The faint light of a flickering street lamp cast shadows across Ben's sleeping form. His son's small chest rose and fell rhythmically, his tiny hand clutching the edge of a tattered blanket. Jack knelt beside him, brushing a lock of dark hair from his forehead. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring the boy's face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. He wanted to stay, to fight for a better life, but the weight of his own inadequacies crushed him. Standing, he placed the envelope with the letter and photo in Ben's small backpack. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as he walked out into the storm, leaving his son behind. Morning broke with an eerie quiet in the apartment. Ben stirred, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as a faint chill brushed his cheeks. The room was cold, colder than usual. He called out for his father, his small voice trembling with a mix of sleepiness and unease. "Dad." Silence answered him. He climbed out of bed, his bare feet padding across the floor as he searched each room. The kitchen was empty, the sink piled with dishes. The living room still smelled faintly of Jack's cologne, but there was no sign of him. Panic crept into Ben's chest, a sharp, unfamiliar ache. He found the backpack left near the door and opened it, his tiny hands pulling out the envelope. The letter was clumsy, the ink smudged in places, but Ben recognized his father's handwriting. He couldn't fully grasp the words, their meaning slipping away like water through his fingers. What he understood was the final line, "I love you, but I can't take care of you anymore." Tears blurred his vision as he clutched the letter to his chest. He sank to the floor, his sobs quiet at first, then loud enough to echo in the emptiness. The weight of abandonment pressed on his small shoulders, a pain he didn't yet have the words to explain. He felt as though he had been swallowed by a vast, lonely void. Hours passed before the caregivers arrived, alerted by the neighbors who had heard Ben's cries. He clung to his backpack as they tried to coax him away, his tear-streaked face full of questions they couldn't answer. The seed of a wound had been planted, one that would grow with him, shaping his understanding of love and trust in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The foster home was a world of contrasts. On the surface, it offered safety, a roof over his head, meals that came on time, and rules that kept chaos at bay. But for Ben, it was never truly home. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with someone else's story. The walls were lined with chipped paint and faded photographs of smiling families that had come and gone, reminders of connections that were always temporary. Ben learned quickly how to navigate this new world. He discovered that keeping quiet earned fewer scoldings, and that blending into the background made him less likely to be noticed by the older boys who enjoyed testing the limits of their strength. At night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, clutching his father's letter like a talisman. Its creases deepened over time as it became both a source of comfort and torment. School was no refuge either. Ben was smaller than his classmates, often the target of teasing that ranged from harmless jokes to cruel taunts. "Where's your daddy?" one boy sneered, cornering him in the playground. Ben's fists clenched, but he didn't fight back. Not then. Instead, he bottled the hurt deep inside, letting it fester in silence. Yet, even in the midst of loneliness, Ben found moments of light. There was Mrs. Carter, his third-grade teacher, who noticed how he sat alone at lunch and gently placed a book on his desk one day. "I think you'll like this," she said, her warm smile piercing his defenses. The book was a story about a boy who felt lost but found his way, and for the first time, Ben saw a reflection of himself. In those quiet moments, reading under a flickering desk lamp or sketching drawings on the back of old homework sheets, Ben discovered a fragile resilience. He began to imagine a life beyond the walls of the foster home, one where he could prove, to himself, to his absent father, to the world, that he was more than a boy abandoned. Decades had passed, but Jack's guilt had only grown heavier with time. He carried it like a second skin, every day a reminder of the life he had walked away from. The small apartment he now called home was filled with shadows of regret, boxes of half-finished projects, unopened letters from old friends, and a stack of journals he could never bring himself to fill. One afternoon, while thumbing through a local newspaper, Jack's eyes caught a headline: "Local hero gives foster kids a fighting chance." The accompanying photo showed a man standing in front of a small community center, a wide smile on his face. Jack's heart skipped. There was no mistaking the man's face. It was Ben. His son had grown into a man he didn't recognize. The years had etched strength into his features, his posture straight and confident, but his eyes, they were the same. They still carried the intensity Jack remembered, a mix of curiosity and vulnerability. He read the article twice, then a third time, absorbing every detail. Ben had founded a program for abandoned and neglected children, turning his own pain into a mission to help others. Jack's hands trembled as he set the paper down. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope sparked within him. If Ben had channeled his pain into something so extraordinary, maybe there was still a chance to reconnect. Maybe, just maybe, Jack could find a way to explain. But that hope was immediately tempered by fear. What if Ben refused to see him? What if his presence only reopened wounds better left healed? Jack stared out the window at the bustling city street below, a world that had moved on while he remained frozen in his mistakes. It was time to move. He had to find Ben, no matter the cost. Jack didn't sleep that night. His mind was a carousel of memories, doubts, and flickers of hope. The photograph of Ben from years ago now sat beside the newspaper clipping on his kitchen table, a timeline of the life he had missed. He studied Ben's face, wondering if his son would recognize him, if he would even want to. The first step was finding him. Jack began his search cautiously, hesitant to dive headfirst into the life of the boy, now a man, he had abandoned. He visited the community center mentioned in the article, standing across the street as if an invisible barrier kept him from stepping closer. Children ran in and out of the brightly painted doors, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy weight in Jack's chest. Inside, Jack could see glimpses of Ben, his broad shoulders, the way he leaned down to talk to a small child, his easy smile. Jack's heart ached with longing and shame. He thought about walking inside, about calling out his name, but fear froze him in place. The shame of what he had done was a mountain too steep to climb in that moment. Instead, Jack began piecing together bits of Ben's life. He visited places mentioned in the article, talking to people who worked at the center or knew about Ben's work. Slowly, a picture emerged. Ben was more than just a survivor. He was a builder, someone who turned pain into purpose. Jack couldn't decide if that made the idea of seeing him easier or harder. He feared being seen as a man seeking absolution, as if showing up now could erase decades of absence. But he couldn't walk away again. Not this time. For Ben, the community center was more than a workplace. It was home. Every corner of the space told a story. The mural on the wall, painted by the kids during a summer camp, the scuffed floors, worn down by years of footsteps, the tiny library stocked with donated books. This was where Ben's life had taken root after years of feeling untethered. The center had started small, a project fueled by nothing but determination and a belief that no child should feel as he had. Ben remembered the first time he stood in the empty building, staring at the cracked walls and sagging ceiling. It seemed impossible, but he had promised himself that he would make it work. For the kids. For himself. Now, it thrived. Children arrived daily, laughing and shouting as they ran through the halls. Parents volunteered, teachers held workshops, and Ben was at the heart of it all. He wasn't just their leader. He was a symbol of what could be achieved when you refused to let the past define you. But no matter how much success Ben found, there was a quiet shadow that lingered. At night, when the building emptied and the noise faded, he felt the emptiness creep back in. He kept his father's letter in his desk drawer, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. He had read it countless times, each word etched into his memory. "I love you, but I can't take care of you anymore." The words were as much a wound as they were a mantra. They drove him to prove that he was worth more than his father's abandonment. Yet, they also reminded him of the boy he had been, waiting for a man who never came back. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered if he could forgive the man who left him behind. But how could he forgive someone who hadn't even tried to return? Jack lingered in the shadows outside the community center, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He gripped the edge of his coat tightly, watching the world move through the glass windows. Inside, Ben was a whirlwind of energy, laughing with the children, kneeling down to tie a little boy's shoelaces, then moving to greet a volunteer. The sight sent a pang through Jack's chest. This was the man Ben had become. Strong, compassionate, everything Jack had hoped for but felt unworthy of witnessing. Each moment felt like a revelation. Jack recognized pieces of himself in Ben's mannerisms, the tilt of his head when he was listening intently, the way he gestured when he spoke. It was uncanny, as if Jack were watching a reflection of what might have been had he made different choices. Yet Ben's kindness, his ability to connect with others so effortlessly, felt like something uniquely his own. Jack shifted uneasily as the minutes stretched on. He'd rehearsed countless ways to approach his son, but every scenario ended the same way. Ben's rejection, his anger, his piercing accusation. Why now? The words rang in Jack's head, cutting through the thin barrier of hope he clung to. Still, he couldn't leave. He watched as Ben gathered the children into a circle, his voice carrying warmth even through the glass. Jack strained to hear but couldn't catch the words. It didn't matter. The scene unfolding before him was enough to ignite both pride and regret in equal measure. He would come back tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, when he felt braver. But as he turned to leave, a young girl inside caught sight of him and pointed. Ben turned toward the window, their eyes locking for the briefest of moments before Jack hurried away, his heart pounding in his chest. The letter felt heavier in Ben's hands than it had when he first found it decades ago. Sitting in his small office at the community center, he unfolded the brittle paper for what must have been the 100th time. The words hadn't changed, but their weight seemed to grow with each passing year. The letter had been tucked away in his backpack that morning, a cruel discovery after he realized his father was gone. As a boy, he'd clung to it as proof that Jack had loved him, however flawed that love had been. As a man, it was a reminder of the questions that haunted him. Why hadn't his father stayed? Had he not been enough? Ben's gaze fell to the corner of his desk, where a small wooden box sat. It held the few keepsakes he'd saved from his childhood, a faded photograph of him and Jack at the park, a small toy car his father had given him on his 5th birthday, and the letter. The objects felt like fragments of a dream he barely remembered, pieces of a puzzle with no clear picture. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box, closing the lid with a soft click. A knock on the door broke his reverie. It was one of the volunteers, a teenage boy named Marcus, who reminded Ben of himself at that age. "Hey, Mr. Bennett," Marcus said, his voice hesitant. "There was a man outside earlier. He looked, I don't know, kinda like you." Ben froze. "What do you mean?" Marcus shrugged. "I just noticed. He was standing there, watching. Thought you might know him." A chill ran down Ben's spine. He waved Marcus off with a casual nod, but inside, his mind raced. Could it be? Was the man outside connected to the past he had worked so hard to overcome? The air in the community center buzzed with its usual energy, but for Ben, the day felt unusually heavy. Marcus's comment about the man outside lingered in his mind, fueling a simmering unease he couldn't shake. Ben tried to focus on the tasks at hand, reviewing grant applications, greeting parents, helping the kids with their art projects, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the possibility of who that man might be. It was late afternoon when Ben finally stepped outside, seeking a moment of quiet. The cool breeze carried the sounds of laughter from the playground nearby. He leaned against the railing, staring into the distance, when a figure caught his eye. Across the street, standing awkwardly near a lamppost, was a man who seemed oddly familiar. Ben's heart skipped. He couldn't be certain, but something about the man's posture, his hesitant movements, stirred a memory he'd buried long ago. Before he could overthink, Ben crossed the street, each step amplifying the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Can I help you?" Ben's voice was steady, but his eyes narrowed as he studied the man. Jack froze. Up close, the years were more visible. Ben's strong jawline, the sharpness in his eyes, the way he carried himself with confidence. Jack swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he said, "Ben, it's me, your father." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Ben stared, his expression unreadable. Then, like a dam breaking, his emotions surged to the surface. "You've got to be kidding me," Ben said, his voice rising. "After all these years? You just show up?" Jack took a step forward, his hands raised in a plea. "I know I don't deserve this. I know I don't deserve you. But I had to see you. I had to try." Ben's jaw tightened. "You had to try?" His words dripped with bitterness. "You abandoned me. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" "I do," Jack said quietly, tears brimming in his eyes. "And I've regretted it every single day." Ben shook his head, turning away, his hands clenching into fists. "You don't get to just walk back into my life like this." He began to walk away, but Jack's voice stopped him. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, let me explain." Ben didn't turn back. "You've got 2 minutes. Talk." Jack's knees felt weak as he tried to form the words that had haunted him for decades. "I left because I thought it was the only way to give you a chance at a better life," he began, his voice trembling. "I was broke, a mess. I thought you'd be better off without me." Ben turned slowly, his eyes blazing with anger. "Better off without you? I spent my whole childhood wondering why I wasn't enough for you to stay. Why you didn't fight for me." Jack's tears spilled over, and he nodded. "I know. I know now that I was wrong. I was a coward. I let my fear and shame take over, and I convinced myself I was doing it for you. But I see now, it was for me. To run away from my failures." Ben's lips tightened, and he crossed his arms over his chest, his voice hard. "So what? You come here now to ease your guilt? To make yourself feel better?" "No," Jack said firmly, surprising even himself with the strength in his voice. "I came because I couldn't live another day knowing I didn't try to make it right. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ben. I don't expect anything. But I wanted you to know that leaving you was the worst mistake of my life." The raw sincerity in Jack's voice cut through Ben's anger, leaving him silent for a long moment. The memories of his childhood, the loneliness, the unanswered questions, warred with the reality of the broken man standing before him. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ben finally said, his voice low. "You don't just fix this with a conversation." Jack nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I understand. But I'm not going anywhere this time. If there's anything I can do to prove it, I will." Ben stared at him, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. "We'll see about that," he said curtly, before turning and walking back into the community center, leaving Jack standing alone on the sidewalk. The office door slammed shut behind Ben as he leaned against it, his breath shallow and ragged. His hands shook, not from anger this time, but from the avalanche of emotions that Jack's presence had unleashed. He had imagined this moment countless times, what he would say, how he would demand answers, but the reality was far messier. He sat heavily at his desk, staring blankly at the framed photo of the first group of kids who had graduated from the community center's program. Their faces, full of hope and pride, had always reminded him of his purpose. Now, they seemed to mock the turmoil brewing inside him. How could Jack just show up after all these years? Did he truly expect forgiveness? Ben's life had been shaped by that absence, by the hole Jack had left behind. Every achievement, every success, had been born from a need to prove that he didn't need his father, that he could thrive without him. And yet, here he was, shaken to his core by a few words and a face he hadn't seen in decades. Across the street, Jack sat on a bench, his head in his hands. The confrontation had taken more out of him than he'd anticipated. He had prepared for Ben's anger, but nothing could have readied him for the sheer force of his son's pain. Every word Ben had thrown at him had landed like a blow, each one a reminder of the chasm Jack had created with his own cowardice. A young boy, no older than 7, approached Jack hesitantly, clutching a soccer ball. "Hey, mister," the boy said, tilting his head. "You okay?" Jack looked up, startled, and forced a smile. "I'm fine, kiddo. Just thinking." The boy frowned, unconvinced. "You looked sad. My mom says talking helps." Jack chuckled softly, more out of disbelief than amusement. "Your mom's a wise woman." The boy nodded solemnly before running off, leaving Jack alone again with his thoughts. That small interaction stirred something in him. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could prove to Ben that he had changed. The next morning, Ben arrived at the community center earlier than usual, still haunted by the previous day's encounter. He had barely unlocked the doors when he saw Jack standing outside, clutching a paper cup of coffee and looking as though he hadn't slept. "What are you doing here?" Ben asked sharply, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice. "I wanted to talk," Jack said, his tone steady but laced with desperation. "Please, just give me a few minutes." Ben sighed, his exhaustion evident. "Fine. But don't think this means anything." He gestured for Jack to follow him inside. The center was quiet in the early hours, the usual chaos of children and volunteers still an hour away. Ben led Jack to his office, where the tension was palpable. Jack sat cautiously, as though the chair might reject him. He placed the coffee cup on the desk, his hands trembling slightly. "I meant what I said yesterday. I want to prove to you that I've changed, that I'm not the man who left you." Ben crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Jack took a deep breath. "I want to help here, at the center. However you'll let me. I'll clean floors, organize donations, whatever it takes. I just want to be part of your life, even if it's just in this small way." Ben's eyes narrowed as he studied Jack's face. He saw the lines of regret etched into his father's features, the unsteady determination in his voice. "This isn't some charity project for you to fix your conscience, Jack. This place means something. If you screw this up—" "I won't," Jack interrupted, his voice firm. "I know I have a long way to go to earn your trust, but I'm willing to put in the work. Just give me a chance." Ben was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine. But don't expect me to go easy on you." Jack's lips twitched into a faint, grateful smile. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Jack's first day at the community center was humbling in ways he hadn't expected. Ben didn't make it easy for him, assigning him tasks that were far from glamorous. scrubbing the floors in the cafeteria, organizing shelves in the storage room, and fixing broken chairs in the workshop. Each time Jack caught a glimpse of Ben, he felt the unspoken weight of his son's watchful eyes, as though Ben were waiting for him to falter. Jack didn't falter. Every scuffed floor tile he cleaned, every box he carried, felt like a small offering of penance. He listened to the chatter of the children around him, their laughter filling the air with a vitality that made his own heart ache. It reminded him of the son he'd left behind, the boy who used to light up the room with his laughter before Jack's absence extinguished it. By mid-afternoon, Jack found himself helping a group of kids with an art project in one of the classrooms. They were making collages, cutting pictures out of old magazines and pasting them onto large sheets of paper. A little girl with pigtails tugged on Jack's sleeve, holding up a crayon drawing of what looked like a family. "Do you think my mom will like this?" she asked shyly. Jack's throat tightened. "I think she'll love it," he said softly, brushing a tear from the corner of his eye before the girl could see. At the end of the day, Jack approached Ben hesitantly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I hope I didn't get in the way today," he said. Ben barely looked up from his clipboard. "You did fine. Just keep showing up." His tone was clipped, but Jack caught the faintest glimmer of something softer in his eyes before Ben turned away. For Jack, those 3 words, "just keep showing up," felt like a lifeline. As the weeks went on, Jack began to settle into a routine at the center. The initial awkwardness of his presence began to fade as the kids warmed to him. They peppered him with questions about his life, and Jack, though careful not to delve too deeply into his past, found himself enjoying their company. Ben, however, remained distant. He was polite but curt, treating Jack more like another volunteer than a father trying to earn his way back into his son's life. Jack couldn't blame him. He'd spent decades being absent. He couldn't expect to undo that damage in a matter of weeks. One afternoon, a crisis tested Jack's resolve. The community center's heating system broke down just as temperatures outside plummeted. The staff scrambled to move the children to a warmer area while Ben frantically called repair services, but none could come until the next day. Jack saw the tension etched into Ben's face and made a quiet decision. Without saying a word, Jack drove to the nearest hardware store and returned with a collection of tools and spare parts. He spent hours in the freezing basement, his fingers stiff with cold as he tinkered with the ancient boiler. By the time he finally got the heat running again, it was well past midnight. The next morning, as the center buzzed with activity once more, Ben pulled Jack aside. "You fixed it?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Jack nodded. "Figured it was the least I could do." Ben stared at him for a long moment. "Thanks," he said finally, the word carrying a weight Jack hadn't expected. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the community center, casting long golden rays across the activity room. Jack sat quietly at a corner table, helping a young boy assemble a puzzle. His hands moved with practiced patience, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the growing tension between him and Ben. He couldn't help but wonder if all his efforts were making a difference, or if he was destined to remain a ghost of Ben's past. The sound of Ben's laughter startled Jack out of his thoughts. He glanced up to see his son leaning against the doorway, chuckling at something a volunteer had said. The rare sound of joy in Ben's voice stirred something deep within Jack. He hadn't heard his son laugh like that since he was a child. As the evening wound down, Ben walked into the room where Jack was tidying up after the kids. For the first time in weeks, Ben didn't seem rushed or guarded. Instead, he leaned against a chair and watched Jack work, his expression unreadable. "You were terrible at puzzles," Ben said suddenly, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Jack looked up, confused. "What?" Ben gestured to the puzzle pieces scattered on the table. "When I was a kid, you'd sit with me, pretending to help, but you'd always put the wrong pieces together. Drove me crazy." Jack froze, a flood of memories rushing back. "I did that on purpose," he admitted with a small laugh. "I liked watching you figure it out and tell me I was wrong." For a brief moment, their eyes met, and the weight of the years between them seemed to lighten. Ben's smirk softened into something warmer, though it vanished quickly as he straightened. "Don't think this changes anything," he said, his voice firm. "But, thanks for sticking around." Jack nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm not going anywhere, Ben. Not this time." Over the following weeks, Jack began to feel a deeper connection to the community center and its mission. His days were filled with tasks that kept his hands busy and his heart fuller than it had been in years. Whether it was mending broken toys or organizing workshops, Jack threw himself into the work with a dedication that didn't go unnoticed. The children flocked to him now, drawn to his patient demeanor and quiet humor. They nicknamed him Mr. Jack, and he quickly became a fixture in their lives. For Jack, their acceptance was a gift he hadn't anticipated, a balm for the wounds he'd carried for so long. Ben, meanwhile, watched from a distance, still hesitant to let his guard down completely. But something had shifted. He began to include Jack in meetings with staff and even asked for his opinion on minor decisions about the center's operations. Though their exchanges were still tinged with caution, there was an unspoken understanding growing between them, a tentative bridge being built, plank by plank. One evening, as the center prepared to host a fundraiser, Jack found himself alone with Ben in the kitchen, assembling trays of hors d'oeuvres. The silence between them was companionable for once, the usual tension replaced by a quiet rhythm. "You know," Ben said after a while, his tone thoughtful, "the kids really like you." Jack glanced at him, surprised. "I like them too. They remind me of you when you were little, full of questions and so much energy." Ben paused, the knife in his hand hovering over a block of cheese. "I'm still trying to figure out what to do with this," he admitted, gesturing vaguely between them. "But I'll give you this. You've done more here than I thought you would." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was another step forward. And for Jack, that was enough for now. The day of the community fundraiser arrived, bringing with it a whirlwind of activity at the center. Balloons swayed in the crisp autumn air, tables brimmed with donated goods for auction, and the smell of freshly baked cookies wafted from the makeshift kitchen. Children ran around, their laughter echoing through the halls, while volunteers worked tirelessly to ensure everything was perfect. Jack stood at the edge of the event, overwhelmed by the sheer energy of it all. He had helped set up tables, hang banners, and even rehearse a skit some of the kids were performing. But now he found himself at a loss. It wasn't the chaos of the event that unsettled him. It was the knowledge that tonight he would be introduced publicly as Ben's father. Ben had insisted on it, much to Jack's surprise. "If you're serious about being part of this, people need to know who you are," he had said. The statement was practical, devoid of emotion, but it carried an undeniable weight. Jack knew this was Ben's way of testing him, of seeing if he could handle the scrutiny. As the evening unfolded, Jack tried to stay in the background, busying himself with small tasks. But as the crowd gathered for the main event, a speech from Ben, he felt every eye turn toward him when Ben gestured for him to join him on the small stage. "This is Jack Bennett," Ben began, his voice steady but distant. "He's new to our team here at the center, but he's been working hard to make a difference. And he's also my father." A murmur rippled through the audience, curiosity and surprise evident on their faces. Jack felt his chest tighten, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. But as Ben continued to speak about the center's mission and the importance of second chances, Jack realized something. Ben wasn't just talking about the kids. He was talking about them. When the applause came, Jack felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, he stood beside his son, not as a shadow of his failures, but as a man trying to make amends. The fundraiser was a resounding success, raising enough money to fund the center's programs for months. But the high of the evening didn't last long. As the last of the guests trickled out and the volunteers began to clean up, Jack saw someone who made his stomach drop, a man from his past, standing just outside the center's doors. It was Frank, an old friend turned enemy. They had once worked together in the factory where Jack's life began to unravel. Frank had been there during Jack's darkest days, witnessing his struggles and failures. Now he was here, his face twisted in a smirk that made Jack's stomach churn. "Well, well," Frank drawled, stepping closer. "Didn't expect to see you playing Mr. Nice Guy. This some kind of act?" Jack stiffened. "What do you want, Frank?" Frank's smirk widened. "Oh, nothing much. Just thought I'd stop by and see if you've been telling everyone the truth." "You remember the truth, don't you, Jack?" Jack's mind raced. He knew exactly what Frank was referring to. Old mistakes, ones he had buried as deeply as he could. Mistakes that could ruin the fragile progress he had made with Ben and the community. Ben stepped out of the building at that moment, his gaze flicking between Jack and Frank. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone wary. "Just catching up with an old buddy," Frank said smoothly, but the look he gave Jack was anything but friendly. Jack forced a smile. "We're done here, Frank." Frank chuckled and tipped an imaginary hat. "For now," he said before disappearing into the night. Ben frowned, turning to Jack. "Who was that?" "No one important," Jack said quickly, his voice tight. But the unease in Ben's expression told Jack that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following Frank's visit were uneasy. Jack could sense Ben watching him more closely, as if weighing every word and action. The truth about Frank and Jack's past hung between them like a storm cloud. Jack couldn't let Frank, or his own mistakes, destroy the fragile bond they were rebuilding. Late one evening, Jack summoned his courage and called Ben into the office. He knew this moment could either solidify their progress or unravel it completely. "There's something I need to tell you," Jack began, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. Ben crossed his arms but sat down, his expression wary. "Go on." Jack leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "When I left, I didn't just walk away from you. I walked into something worse. Men like Frank, they were my way of avoiding responsibility. I got involved in things I'm not proud of, things that hurt people. And now, Frank wants to use that against me." Ben's eyes narrowed. "So, he's blackmailing you?" "Not yet," Jack admitted, his shoulders sagging. "But he will. And I didn't want to hide it from you. Not anymore." Ben's jaw clenched, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Why are you telling me this now? To get me to fight your battles?" "No," Jack said firmly. "I'm telling you because I want to be honest with you for once. If I lose what little trust I've earned, I want it to be because I told the truth, not because I let another lie fester." Ben stared at him, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "We'll deal with Frank. Together. But you lie to me again, and that's it. No more chances." Jack nodded, relief and resolve washing over him. "I won't." The next time Frank appeared, his smirk faded when he saw Ben standing beside Jack. "This your plan?" Frank sneered. "Hiding behind your kid?" Ben stepped forward, his tone icy. "We're not hiding. If you think you can drag my father, or this center, into whatever mess you're stirring up, you're mistaken. I'll make sure the authorities know exactly who to watch." Frank's face darkened. His resentment was palpable, his jealousy of Jack's new life radiating in every glare. "You think you can just start over? That people like you get a clean slate?" Jack, finally finding his voice, said, "No one gets a clean slate. But I'm not running anymore, Frank. I'm done with that life." Frank lingered for a moment, his eyes flicking between the two of them, before retreating into the night. The confrontation left Jack shaken, but he felt something new, pride in standing with his son. The fundraiser was the highlight of the year, a celebration of everything the community center had achieved. Balloons swayed in the cool evening breeze, tables brimmed with auction items, and the chatter of families filled the air. As the main event began, Ben took the stage, his commanding presence silencing the crowd. Jack stood near the back, blending in, until Ben's words called him forward. "This center exists because of people who believe in second chances," Ben said, his voice strong. "That belief is personal to me because I've lived it. For a long time, I didn't think someone who hurt me as deeply as my father did deserved a second chance. But over the past months, he's shown me otherwise. There was a moment," Ben continued, his voice softening, "when I realized he wasn't just here to make himself feel better. It was after a night when the heat broke, and I found him in the basement at midnight, fixing it for the kids. That's when I saw something different. He wasn't fixing a heater. He was trying to fix himself, for them, and for me." Ben gestured for Jack to join him. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Jack only saw the pride in his son's eyes. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Ben sat beside Jack on the center's front steps. The stars glittered above them, the world finally quiet. "I used to think forgiving you meant letting go of what you did," Ben said, his voice contemplative. "But now I see it's more about letting go of what I've carried all this time. The anger, the questions, they've weighed me down just as much as your absence did." Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Ben. But hearing you say that, it means everything to me." Ben gave him a small, tentative smile. "I'm not saying we're there yet, but I think we will be." Jack nodded, his chest swelling with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. As they sat together, the bond between them, fragile but growing, felt like a new beginning. Thank you so much for watching this emotional journey until the very end. We hope Jack and Ben's story of redemption and second chances touched your heart as much as it did ours. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share how it made you feel. Your feedback means the world to us. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the story. Share it with friends and family who love powerful and inspiring tales, and subscribe to our channel for more emotional and heartfelt narratives. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have so many more moving journeys to share with you. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next one.